here. Hi, it says we're live. This is Turtletalks.net. I'm here with Bob Jackson. The subject today is climate change. We're in the Southwest, the little town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, which I guess seems a little foreboding considering the topic, which is truth and consequences to truth or not truth or fake consequences. I don't know. But anyway, what's paramount to me is that that we live with hope. And what does that mean? To me, it means that we live to try to improve society, to try to improve our relationships with each other. That's where the real work goes, and probably the beginning of climate change, probably arguably in 1850, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the ability for man to increase his lifestyle, increase the use of electricity, increase the use of warmth in winter, the coal revolution, steam machinery. Anyway, so let's get at it, Bob. Let's talk about climate change and some of the issues it brings up for us humans.
Well, you and I have had several discussions on this topic before, and I believe it'd be beneficial to try to grab a few of those key elements that we have discussed. First of all, climate change is something that's very real. It is going to affect each and every one of us. No question about that. It already is. And a few of the things I'll explain about personal experience in agriculture will bring that out in a few minutes. But the one thing that I did want to mention at the outset is that while many of us hear a lot about climate change, and while many of us are very concerned about it, we all should be, it is something that historically is such a major issue. It is not going to be solved by either of our two major political parties. Historically, the major political parties have avoided issues that are that significant because it's not a good political platform. And their objective and their priority is to attain power and maintain power. And that you don't do that by attacking really huge major issues.
Not only that, Bob, but very few presidential candidates say, elect me, I'm for doom and gloom. People don't like to hear that. They want to vote for a better life, a better economy, a better whatever, which I'd say we have a rough road ahead of us.
Well, and if the major political parties are not going to solve the problem, then we have to ask the question, what can we do? And one of the things that I wanted to discuss is what kind of constructive approach can we take individually, as a community? And, that's what this is. This is a societal issue. It's a humanity issue. And we need to look at it in that regard and have that discussion. And hopefully the people that, view this, listen to this, will have input on additional things that we can discuss, additional things we can share with everyone out there about what can be done.
I hope folks out there will, in fact, send some questions in, and that we can go from there. I think three areas kind of come to mind. One is pollinators. We know our food supply depends on them. That's something we can provide flowers for and things for in our backyard. There's something we can do there. Mm-hmm. I'm always interested in our local response because of the lack of response from the government, which is very conservative. Either, and I'm not talking about liberal and conservative. I mean, moves very slowly and cautiously because they don't want to offend anyone. And so, what can we do locally? And more important to me is, how do we proceed? Do we point fingers at someone else, or do we, point fingers at ourselves? What can we do, as opposed to pulling somebody else down? So, you want to speak to pollination and what's going on with our natural food supplies?
Well, when you look at it from our individual supply of food, which matters to most of the people on this planet, over half of our food supply is available to us because of the pollination from insects. And so when we look at that specific impact of climate change, in the last 2 decades, over 75% of the biomass of all insects on planet Earth are gone.
Wow.
So we have 1/4 of the biomass of insects that we had 20 years ago. And the reasons, according to all the scientists that are looking at this, are not complex. They boil down to 2 factors. One is the change in the climate, including the severity of the swings in the climate. And the other factor is insecticides and other chemical agents that are causing massive death. For example, with bees specifically, the leading pollinator that we're concerned about, the hive death syndrome is a very huge factor. In our particular experience, to relate this to climate change, 5 years ago, my wife and I went together with a large group of people, all of whom were at or in retirement. And we just said, we want to do something good that would be a good investment for our retirement. We didn't particularly I've been involved with Wall Street for 40 years and didn't like the corruption there. And just thought, it would be good to go into agriculture. So we all went together, pooled our resources, and bought one of the largest blueberry farms in the United States because we thought blueberries are good. The antioxidants are good. They're very healthy. It would be something good to do and something, that would make sense to do as an investment for retirement. Our experience has been fascinating, to say the least, over the last 5 years. We've had 4 harvest seasons. We've had 5 weather events, extreme weather events that have affected the harvest every year for those 4 harvest years. And each of those 5 events statistically only happen once in every 100 years or less. So that means that we've had 5 events that shouldn't have happened at all. And those 5 events have happened just in 4 harvest years. So that's the severity of the weather that's happening because of climate change. And then relative to specifically pollinators, we're losing, as are almost all farmers and specifically beekeepers that are professionals in pollination. We're losing at least 1/3 of our entire crop of bees. We bought 500 hives last year for our farm. We lost over 1/3 of them to death in just 1 year.
Well, I know all the bees that pollinate the almond crop in California are trucked there from, I believe, Florida every season to help to pollinate the trees. And I'm sure that's going to be a real problem and continue to be worse and worse.
Well, it is. When the pollination of the almond fields happens, they pay a premium. So you have bees coming actually from all over the United States because that's where you make the most money on your beehives. And so you put them on a truck and you truck them in many cases all the way across the country to pollinate the almond crop. The other thing that does happen is if you have an infected hive of bees, all of them are congregating at the same tribal mass and getting to spread that disease. So that is another factor, which a few years ago they thought was the major factor in the accelerating rate of death among bees and pollinators. But then they found no. Once the research has come out in the last few years, it's again boiled down to climate change and to point a finger that definitely needs to be pointed. Monsanto.
And also regulation of pesticides.
Right. And as we've discussed, it's fascinating that the current administration, when I say they're not going to address climate change, they're also not going to address this specific issue of pollination. They have reduced the requirements for chemical use among farmers. And again, if you own beehives for your own farm, your bees don't know the borders of your farm. They're going to go into other
air
farms.
And water.
And just because we don't spray during, anything on any of our crops, because we're trying to convert most of our farm to organic anyway, but we don't spray anything on our crops during the day when any pollinators would be active.
Right.
If we're going to use any spray, even if it's just fertilizer, we do that in the evening because we don't want to affect the pollinator.
Let's get back to, so that's one thing I think that people can do locally, because I want to leave people with a sense that, what can I do? You know what I mean? Because humans, I think, we're a social animal, and we talk to each other, and obviously multiply that by the internet and phones and everything else. We're really talking to each other. We transmit, just like the air and the water, we transmit thought. And if I call you up and say, I'm not feeling so great, all of a sudden you go, well, what's wrong? And your concern level goes up, and we can't go, play tennis or golfing. Have you seen a doctor? All of a sudden the conversation goes down. And I'm just concerned that people understand that that's contagious as well. So I think if there's anyone out there who has a good story to tell about how they've grown some flowers for pollinators, or what are they doing locally? Are they helping to enforce local bans on pesticides? Municipalities in America are beginning to, even though it's against the law, mayors are going, are flaunting the law to say you cannot spray that stuff within a mile of our town, and because of the cancer possibilities and so on. Well, so that's one thing. What else? You want to address that whole sense of we then therefore need to really, through legislation or lawsuit, or can we stop any of that from occurring as a voter, or and that we're a nonprofit organization. We're not going to espouse a particular candidate, but we certainly can go behind legislation. And if you know of any legislation on the books that we could write to our local officials, maybe you can get your town council to write an official letter, which then represents a municipality versus just you as an individual. I don't know.
Well, all of those things are beneficial to start out in your own backyard. If you can plant plants that allow pollinators to have the food they need, and food without pesticides on it, so they don't take that back to their hive and spread that. Those things are very constructive. And oddly enough, in some of the places like where we live in New Mexico, it's important to leave water out because they need to have water just like any other animal. So those kind of things are good. Again, not whatever you are going to spray, even if it's fertilizer, try to spray it in the evening or after dark if you can, because pollinators are not active then, because even fertilizer is not good for a bee to get on it.
Right.
And a lot of the fertilizer will go right into the bee's system. So those kind of things are important. And there are certain flowers that attract certain insects, just like certain flowers attract certain birds. And hummingbirds, again, do a tremendous job of pollinating. Yeah. So just encouraging hummingbird population and activity and supporting that is good. Anything you can do is beneficial for society, for humanity. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, one article that you shared with me from the New Yorker, it also makes you feel better. Internally, you feel better because you are trying to do something constructive about a situation that's very frustrating. If the government is not doing anything to try to help with a major issue that affects our lives, then it's incumbent upon us to do it. But it does really edify your own life if you're doing whatever you can do.
Yeah, it helps you point your finger at yourself and not someone else. I think that helps us a lot in terms of that. And then that may be contagious, and other people, you can talk to your friends. We all have what they call a natural sphere of influence. I don't know the representative from this area personally, but I bet I know somebody who does. So I can go talk to that friend, and then they can talk directly to someone that they know. So that's a possibility. So what else do you think we could do locally or individually to to address this. Tomorrow, I guess, 21st, no, 20th is the climate change day in New York City, and the kids have been told that if their parents sign off on it, they can ditch school and go give their 2 cents, because our young people are the ones who are going to really kind of be looking at the impacts of this. I hope to live to see the impacts. It's kind of weird. I hope to live long enough to continue to help. But chances are my daughter who's 37 or my son who's 35, they're going to be right in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we say, and maybe that'll be sooner or later. But I think people are, well, I see it as a spiritual problem. I almost always see things as spiritual problems. Why? Because our spirit is what motivates us. We see facts. Facts rarely motivate anybody. They're dry. So what? But how do you feel about that? Well, in my heart, I might feel a certain way. But what about in your spirit? This affects us, I think, as humans. If you take the notion that we're made in God's image, then everything you see is, in fact, according to Native Americans, certainly in their cosmology, is sacred. So our attitude toward the planet is now coming back at us, because we are connected. It's amazing that we breathe air, but don't think we have to worry about pollution. We drink water, but we don't have to think about that too much. That new plant will bring lots of jobs. And then, of course, the statistics come out that now the evidence of cancer in that area has gone up, or there's something that's not quite right here. How do you see? What do you think about what I just said? Do you think that has something to do with? In other words, you go over here and you stop coal, right? No more coal. Fine, okay. But then we come to find out that over on the other side, there's chemicals are still being produced. The oil industry now has decided that they want to put a 40% increase into plastic because they realize they're not going to be able to burn it anymore. As modes of transportation, what are they going to do with their oil? Well, single-use plastics are being outlawed. Plastic is a pretty amazing product. Where can it be most inert? Where, if they're going to do that, does that mean that we can do affordable housing with in other words, it's a question of how we see ourselves and our children. We've always looked to try to better ourselves, but what does that mean now? How do we translate the betterment materially with betterment in terms of how we relate to each other and how the future will unfold humanly? Because
well, when you've been talking about it at that level, which when you talk about this being a spiritual issue, for example, I consider that to be talking about it at the highest level. And yes, it is a spiritual issue. And yes, we do have labels that get in the way of trying to allow us the freedom of thinking about this openly and coming up with solutions. Because when you mention water and the importance of water and building that plant that employed a lot of people in your local town, you built the plant, but then all of a sudden you realized it was impacting or destroying the purity of your source of water for your town. I grew up a mile from the Ohio River in Kentucky and Indiana.
Yeah.
And at the time, in the early 70s, when I was in high school and started paying attention to environmental issues, I wound up going to a conference and was stunned to find out that river, that huge river that I'd been around my whole life, the water in that river, a gallon had already been taken out of the river and used by plants upstream and municipalities 10 times and put back into the river before it got to where I lived in southwestern Indiana. And that was fascinating. And there were only 2 species of fish left in the river. The only ones that could live were catfish and carp. And so, that was prior to any real legislation that then took place. Legislation took place. Back then, you could do things about these issues. Now, when you look at what can we do on a national and global basis, can we stop the negative momentum that is very much in place with climate change? And the answer from most scientists is no. If you drop everything, which, by the way, the Green New Deal, flies in the face of what most people label capitalist society.
Right.
Don't get in the way of our profit. Don't get in the way of our free enterprise. Don't dictate how we can start and run that plant that'll employ people in my community that might pollute my river. We have to look at this not as a capitalist issue or a socialist issue or a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's a humanity issue. And the one thing that's interesting so far, humanitarian and humanity issues, that label hasn't gotten in the way. So I think that might be a good way of looking at it. But yes, it is a personal issue, a very personal issue. And the New Yorker, one article that they just came out with recently, to put it in perspective, to back up for a second, I thought it was a very, very good, very straightforward synopsis of what we have to look forward to if we don't stop and really totally prioritize this issue. In the not too distant future, and I'm not talking about 50 or 60 or 70 years, I'm talking about a decade or two, we're looking at radical destabilization of life on Earth, including massive crop failures. We don't have to look far to find those. I've found those in the last 4 harvest seasons in the blueberry business. Apocalyptic fires, you don't have to look very far to see those. And I'm also in the timber business, which is wonderful. Every year that you try to regulate how much timber you should cut to manage your crop correctly, you're left with the real difficult paradox of, aren't I risking every bit of any future profit I can make by not cutting all of it this year because of the increase in forest fires?
Wow.
Imploding economies, which will result from the continuation of the existing trend in climate change, not the acceleration, not the establishment of new trends, the existing trend. Epic flooding, hundreds of millions of refugees we're already seeing being dislocated by this issue. In fact, in some places, huge cities are already being relocated because they're going to be underwater in the next 5 to 10 years, or some are already going underwater. Miami Beach is struggling to keep water out of their city. And then regions that are just becoming inhabitable for all kinds of different climate change issues, as well as permanent drought. So let's talk about something that's seldom associated with this, but it is a factor in any issue we talk about in life: balance. When you look at balance, we have been out of balance arguably for the last 150 years. We've been favoring the establishment of increased industry to support employment of growing populations. Paul Ehrlich talked about back in the late 60s, the population bomb. What are the consequences if we continue to increase the population on this planet? Well, he was right. The consequences are here. And so when you look at balance, balance is not static. You don't reach a static balance, and that's utopia. That's a dream. That's
another definition of death, is when everything is still.
Yeah.
That's probably no life in it.
Well, balance is dynamic.
Yes.
And what we have to realize now, if you talk about a scale of balance, or you talk about a pendulum swinging back and forth, the pendulum has swung way too far to one side. We're suffering the consequences of establishment of expansion of business, the use of coal you mentioned.
Something called a consumer economy.
Right.
We can consume our way to prosperity. That seems like kind of an interesting thought. What when you get to the end of your stuff, what's left? You know what I mean?
Well, and because the balance has been favoring all those factors, which now we're realizing the climate consequences, we now have to either get to the point where sometime in the next few decades, the world the planet will be uninhabitable for human beings, which is not the outcome that most people want to think about, and certainly not the platform a politician wants to run on. And we have to take that balance, and we can't move it to a level playing field. We have to move that balance to the point where we disfavor those things that are having negative consequences, and we invest and sacrifice to the extent that we can do whatever we can do individually, as a community, as a country, and globally, to try to offset that whole situation.
Yeah, so it brings us to that title, which I thought was masterful, except that no one believes it or understands it or wants to have it. An inconvenient truth. So our society's been built on appliances, on convenience, where you don't have to cook dinner. It can be brought to you. You don't have to worry about where your food comes from. It's trucked to the supermarket. Where does broccoli come from? It comes from a truck. The truck comes, and when the truck stopped coming, because the broccoli is not being grown, because the climate is no longer good enough in that area or stable enough to have a crop, then what? Solar power, as it's sent over our existing power lines, is, I think, a fool's errand, because it's centralized. Now, I understand the infrastructure is trillions of dollars. It's taken years to bring up these big and very wasteful transmission lines, because they blow a lot of the power that they're trying to bring to you. And if we were able to then favor the establishment of individuals who are already buying houses, already in the commerce, if you want to keep some capitalism, there you have it, incorporate the loan to include your own battery pack and your own solar panels, which then can charge your electric car, you have now whipped three things. The 20% of our use of petroleum is transportation. Heating and our refrigeration system, which eats up a lot of power, our air conditioning systems, which eat up a lot of power, and peak load, and transferring peak load instead of using natural gas, do what they did in Australia, which is a huge bank of batteries to be drawn on when peak load is important. So I think I understand, if I understand you correctly, this balance, which is, by the way, the keynote of the last 100 years. Anyone who's sane has been saying we're out of balance in every area. 80% of the population of the world lives in cities. Well, in a way, that's pretty amazing. 2.5% of the population, maybe, in America are farmers. 2.5%, which means what? It means large farms doing crops that are monocrops, which then destroy the habitat of the butterfly, which is another pollinator, etc. So I think you're right. I think in order to seize back life and our ecosystem, I mean, let's be selfish about this. You know, we want our children and our grandchildren to have a life. Mm-hmm. Now, in the 50s, we wanted them to have a bigger car, a better home. Suburbs were just rampant. That was the big thing. Now you can't drive from the suburb into the work in the city because there's no employment in the suburbs. So now, so this whole cities have to be replanned, and our zoning laws need to be changed so you can live above your store. Things that we thought were great improvements. Well, so think about it in your own city, in your own time, in your own place, and let's open a discussion. That's what I hope Turtle Talks will be about. Right behind us is a photo I took of the Gila cave dwellers. Now, just to show you that this problem of farming and sustaining life is not new. It's just global. So the cave right here was utilized for 80 years in the Southwest. It's up in the Gila wilderness. It's a great trip if you want to come see it. The important thing about it is that the hunter-gatherers who lived here was nothing left to hunter-gather because there was an 80-year drought. What they found was a water source which was underground, and they pulled back into the caves. And when the drought was over, then they were able to go and expand out again. I think that's why I chose this as a backdrop to our program, just to say, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. There's, you could say arguably that the 40-day and 40-night flood was when the Mediterranean breached the Black Sea, and there's clear water at the bottom of the Black Sea, which was, it's lighter than seawater. So how did it get down there when it should be up here? Well, it got flooded. That was a local event, but that was the known world. So we've been there before. Humans have been there before. Every tragedy, if you go back to the Greeks, you'll find all kinds of human tragedies caused by humans. And as one of my favorite philosophers said, isn't life hard enough without us making it hard on each other? So Bob, I know we'll have more to say in the future on this. I hope you'll send in your questions. And I'm hoping that our effort here can be replicated by people in other cities around America and small rural populations, because something can be done about our quality of life as we relate to each other. Mm-hmm. And then as we relate to each other, I wanted to put a little plug in for a documentary that I just saw called Aluna. It's on the indigenous tribe in the last theocracy on the planet. They're in northern Colombia. And they did a little bit like what Pythagoras did, which is if you go into a dark cave, you begin to look inward instead of outward. And their chief, they're run by the fellow who went in at age 8 and was there until he was 25 or something. And then he has insight. But then when he came out and saw everything, it was fresh. Well, Luna, you can find it, BBC documentary. It's on the internet right now. And he takes you down to the ocean, shows you the power plant, shows you how the road cut the freshwater lagoon off from the ocean, showed you that the glaciers up at the top aren't getting any moisture anymore, so they can't freeze the water. So and how the cycle works. So it's wonderful that they don't have any writing, so they're being translated. And he said that his younger brothers who know how to write will not look down upon the wisdom that he's trying to tell people. Well, it's a wonderful, it's a lovely documentary. So until next time, Thursdays at 1:30 live, and then it'll be archived for you to watch. It's on the YouTube channel, TORC, the Truth or Consequences, space news. That's the YouTube channel name. So, Bob?